Welcome. Today, we're going to talk about the parallels and the similarities of the two mass suicides that took place in Guyana, South America. The suicide from November 18, 1978 at Jonestown, and the suicide from the dry season of 1844. The first, 400 dead. The second, reported more than 900 dead. The first from year 1844, the second from November 18th, 1978 at Jonestown, Guyana. So how the wooden sign at Jonestown, where the bodies lay, remarks about what occurred before. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I was 15 years old in November 1978, living near Washington, D.C., Rockville, Maryland, when the Jim Jones mass suicide took place. First learned about it in the Washington Post and from other news stories and from the Time magazine cover story early December 1978. First learned about the 1844 mass suicide in year 1996 at age 32, when I took upon a solo bicycle trip across Venezuela, solo 635 miles in 7 days across Venezuela, or roughly 1,020 kilometers. The maps I collected on that trip, privately purchased maps at the Canaima National Park, which bordered the country of Guyana. Purchased these maps, which spoke of Matawai, or suicide, or I want to die Tepui, its other name known as Kukanam, next to the famous Mount Horiyama. So in this park, about the size of the state of West Virginia, it's the sixth largest park in the world, Canaima, smaller than some of the African game parks. Anyway, I ventured the first 2 days of the bicycle trip across the park, heading north from Santa Elena de Urian on the border with Brazil, Guyana, and Venezuela, up toward the Venezuelan coast. So the mass suicide happened at the base of Mount Kukanam. It's 4,000 feet above the elevated plain, and the vertical walls 4,000 feet straight up, so it was impossible for any human to reach the summit and commit suicide before the 1840s. Man first landed on top by helicopter in 1963. I've since been to Venezuela twice and Guyana once, so I purchased the 1958-year published book written by English travel writer Michael Swan, entitled The Marches of El Dorado, about Michael Swan's personal travels through Brazil, Guyana, and Venezuela. He covered the mass suicide led by the Native American young buck named Awakaipu, and he did not have exact footnotes in the book Marches of El Dorado, but he listed 14 different writers or source material, all in English except for the first source, which was a book written by Carl Ferdinand Appun, a German explorer that worked for a number of years in Caracas, Venezuela. Appun could speak Spanish, English, certainly German, and knew other Native American tongues that he had picked up in his explorations and travels in South America. Okay. So the original account about the 1844 mass suicide came from the German book Under den Tropen, Jena Publishing, 1871, from Germany. Part of the story has to go back to the story of the German Schomburgk brothers, Richard and Robert Schomburgk, who were born in Germany and worked for the Royal Geographical Society in London. Now, they made a 4-year Guyana boundary survey for 4 years from 1840 to 1844. Now, they returned back to London in June of 1844. One of their guides was a Native American named Awakaipu that traveled extensively with them on their surveys and exploration through the Amazonian regions, the southern part of Guyana, mapping all of the boundary. So I'm going to revert back and tell the story from when I originally first learned about the first mass suicide from September, October 1844, more or less. So Michael Swan is doing his travels through Guyana and Venezuela, and this is his account. He is talking with his guide and cook, a Native American named Austin. "Austin," I said, while he was cooking my rice and curry, "round here, wasn't this Bekaranta, the place where all your people long ago had a battle and mass suicide?" "Yes, sir," he answered. "This Bekaranta, the white people's land, place where bad man Awakaipu, he come long time ago." The amazing story of Awakaipu is well documented. He was an Arikuna Indian who had lived for some time in Georgetown, the capital of British Guiana, and Awakaipu had learned English. The Schomburgks recognized his usefulness and employed him on their expeditions. Richard Schomburgk speaks in admiration of the way he, Awakaipu, behaved when attacked by a piranha fish. Biting his lips with the raging agony, he rolled about in the sand, yet no tears flowed from his eyes, no cry passed his lips. From the tone of the Schomburgks' remarks about him, he seems to have kept his true nature from his employers. After the Schomburgks had left the colony, Awakaipu, still only 25 years of age then, was seized by a folie de grandeur and wished to make himself the chief of all the Indian tribes of English Guyana. He sent messengers throughout the Indian country saying that all who wished to see wonderful happenings and to know the way to become as rich and powerful as the white men should meet at the beginning of the dry season in the valley of the Kukanam at the foot of Mount Hoodiaima. All who came, he said, must forget their quarrels and bring presents, for which they would receive magical presents in return. 1,000 Indians from every tribe gathered at the foot of Mount Hoodiaima and gave Awakaipu knives, gunpowder, rifle shot, and fish hooks. In return, Awakaipu gave them pages from the London Times newspaper, which he said would act as charms. I have already mentioned the Indians' reverence for print or drawings. These copies of the London Times had been used by Richard Schomburgk for pressing his wild flowers. Now I'll interject for a second here and deviate from the Michael Swan narrative in the book. Now these Native Americans in those parts had never seen newspaper before. They had gunpowder, fish hooks, and rifle shot, but they had never seen newspaper. Awakaipu named his settlement Bekaranta, which is an Indian form of a Dutch Creole word meaning land of the white people. He built a 2-storied hut, living on the upper floor himself, and installed a harem of chosen girls in the floor below. Now I'm going to deviate a second time from the Michael Swan narrative. What happened was the Schomburgk brothers, on their mapping exploration journey in 1842, had already constructed the 2-story hut at a village known as Ibarema Yang. Awakaipu reoccupied the 2-story dwelling about September, October 1844. Now I'm going to return to the Michael Swan narrative. Awakaipu enhanced his mystery by rarely mixing with the gathered Native Americans, and when he addressed them, he swathed himself in magical ritual garments so that only his eyes were seen through the folds. On these occasions, he threatened death to anyone who did not obey him implicitly. He encouraged kasari drinking bouts and dancing, hoping that this would induce a state of mind in which all would accept his leadership.
Later, he decided that he would have to kill all untrustworthy elements so that the other Native Americans would follow him. On the night of a general orgy, he appeared and announced through the folds of his gown that he had just been received by an audience of the Great Spirit Awakaipu, who had told him that the Native Americans must never be driven out of their own land by the white people. They must become greater and more powerful than the whites. They must have white women as wives, and themselves have white skins. Awakaipu, he went on, had told him that all gathered at Bekarantha could have white skins. They would have to kill each other, and their souls would rise to the summit of Horiaima, where they would be reborn and return to the valley of Kukanam in 2 days. Their skin would be white, and they would have all the knowledge of the white people, and they would be rulers of all the other Native Americans. Awakaipu had touched the deep-rooted and still surviving skin envy of the Native Americans. They heard him with terror. Awakaipu seized a war club, attacked a man, and smashed his head open so that the blood spurted into a gourd of kasiri, which Awakaipu then drank. The drunken Indians now began to fight each other, and submerged hatreds erupted once again. It is said that 400 men, women, and children were killed during the night of massacre, or they had committed suicide, and the survivors waited day after day to see the resurrected come down from the top of Horiaima. When 2 weeks of time had passed, there were murmurings against Awakaipu, who seems to have had sufficient belief in his intimations from Awakaipu not to leave the valley. Food was now running out, and there was hunger in the Native American camp. Eventually, it was realized that there would be no resurrection, and a party of Native Americans went to the 2-storied hut of Awakaipu and beat him to death with their clubs. So this is where Michael Swan has his own interpretation, and he says in the book from 1958, "It is a strange, inconclusive story with no indication of the real state of Awakaipu's mind. I have no doubt of the substantial truth of the incident. Decades later, travelers in the region who knew nothing of the massacre found small portions of the London Times in Native American huts being used as amulets." So what we have to understand about the Schomburgks is that they returned to Europe in June of 1844. They have no idea when they're back in Europe that young buck Awakaipu goes on this megalomaniac quest where he wants to be the chief of all the tribes in Guyana. Robert Schomburgk passed away in Berlin, Germany in March 1865, so this was before Appun arrived back in Germany in 1868. Richard Schomburgk fled the revolution in Europe in 1849 and later settled in life in Australia, where he worked for the Royal Botanical Gardens in Australia and lived till year 1891. I'm not sure if Richard ever learned about the mass suicide by reading Appun's book later in life. Part of the account which Michael Swan did not include from Appun's 1871 year published book Under den Tropen was that the story was told to Appun by the son of one of the Native American men who clubbed Awakaipu to death. So the story of the mass suicide was related to Appun about the year 1868. Now I have to realize or make a judgment on the accuracy of Appun's story. Appun was a highly educated scientist from Germany and understood fairly well the Native American tongues of his guides, that led him around through the interior jungles. So I have to believe that his recording of the number of 400 deaths by suicide in battle was in no way an exaggeration. Appun traveled back to Germany in year 1868. His book is published in year 1871 and sold fairly well in Germany and Europe. Shortly after it was published, he traveled back and returned to South America about late 1871 or 1872 year. So on his next 1872 expedition back into the jungles in Guyana, Appun had a bad moment or panic or misjudgment. He believed for whatever reason that he was about to be cooked and eaten alive by his Native American guide. He swallowed a draught of carbolic acid. His Native American guides carried him to the closest white man dwelling, which was known as the Mazaruni Penal Settlement, built in year 1842 on the Mazaruni River in the interior jungles of Guyana, far away from any other white man's civilization. So sadly, Appun died 2 days later in total agony from the ingestion of this carbolic acid. So with Michael Swan also, sadly, he died in year 1967 from an overdose of alcohol and sleeping pills. He does not live to witness the mass suicide which happened later in Guyana in 1978. Now, what Michael Swan failed to mention in his book Marches of El Dorado was he missed the story from the Richard Schomburgk 2-volume set Rising in Guyana, which was translated into English by Walter Roth and published in 1922. Michael Swan missed a couple of important things. The Schomburgks first go to the area of Mount Roraima to do their border survey in year 1842. And on this trip, Awakaipu is with them. They also have African porters, Native American guides that have to make contact with other Native Americans before they get to the area, so there's peace and tranquility and no violence for them to do their border boundary surveys. Anyway, on this trip to Roraima, 2 things happened. One of their guides, Kate, wife of one of the porters, was bit by a pit viper snake and died in agony. The other story was that in this vicinity of Mount Roraima, at one of the Native American villages, lived the most beautiful young maiden that Richard Schomburgk reported that they had seen in all of their 4-year boundary surveys. So this beautiful young Cummivavre lived at one of the villages there. And her father was trying to keep the Schomburgks and certainly Awakaipu away from Cummivavre. The reason Awakaipu goes back to this area is he's after Cummivavre, the most beautiful Native American woman in all of those parts. This is the reason why he gathers 1,000 Native Americans and wants to be the chief of all the tribes of British Guiana. Certainly he was trying to impress Cummivavre and make her his wife. Sadly, it all went downhill that led to the mass suicide and violence that night. Many of the victims of the mass suicide that night consumed kasire, the toxic liquid which is the leftover extraction from the cassava plant that you bleed out with a matapee that has to be squeezed out. Now, with my own input, I realized that there's some other factor that may have been one of the reasons for the mass suicide. After the Schomburgks had left the colony, Awakaipu is back in Georgetown, where he most likely came under the influence of the U.S. missionaries known as the Millerites, who were spreading their gospel around the globe that the world was soon going to end. When the world failed to end, they now came up with a new date that the world was going to disappear, October 22nd, 1844. This may have infected Awakaipu's mind, where he realized that he needed to get Cummivavre as a wife before the ending of the world. In 1962, James Warren Jones, Jim Jones, went to Georgetown, Guyana for the first time. He looked around and realized there was too much competition in Georgetown with many churches. Then he later went to Brazil in 1963 to try to establish churches there in Belo Horizonte. Jones soon left South America and returned to Indiana. A decade later, Jones was now a force to be reckoned with in California. He had no fear of competition when he went to Georgetown in 1974 in order to lease land from the Guyanese officials. Anyway, back in Georgetown, Guyana in 1962, that competition was mainly the Seventh-day Adventist Church, descendants of the Millerites. And these Millerites had arrived early on in the 1830s and 40s when Richard Schomburgk came down with yellow fever when he first arrived in the colony in year 1840. So they packed Richard Schomburgk in ice so he wouldn't die. Now you're asking yourself, Georgetown, Guyana is just a couple of degrees north of the equator. How do they have ice in a tropical place in year 1840? Well, the ice came from the merchants in Boston, who were the ice cutters that would ship ice on wooden ships packed in straw and sawdust in large containers in the bellies of these ships, and they would bring the ice to ice houses in tropical country. So these people that delivered the ice, a lot of them were Millerites. So Awakaipu back in Georgetown in 1844 wished he could have brought ice to the far regions of the tropical jungle as presents for these Native Americans. Instead, he was left with Millerite newspapers and copies of the London Times. Jim Jones's story is very well known, so now I will focus on the similarities between the two mass suicides. Awakaipu threatened death to anyone who did not obey him implicitly. Jones also threatened death with any who wanted to leave the People's Temple. So both Awakaipu and Jim Jones had their concubines. Awakaipu had the two-story hut where there was the concubine of young maidens on the ground floor. Jones also had young, beautiful women in his church that he preyed on. So in both the mass suicides, Awakaipu and the Native Americans consumed kasiri, the toxic leftover liquid extracted from cassava. At Jonestown, the people drank Flavor Aid mixed with cyanide. So when Jones realizes he wants to return to Guyana in the 1970s with his filibustering scheme, he sent attractive young women to sleep with the Guyanese customs officials with immigration. In this way, he could get his cult into Guyana. The Guyanese also were duping Jones by giving him land near the disputed Venezuelan border. If there had been a problem and the Venezuelan army invaded, U.S. citizens would have been at risk. So you're asking yourself, why would the Venezuelan military invade Guyana? This problem goes back more than 400 years, border disputes between Spain and England, back to the days of Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was executed on October 29, 1618, for his failure to find El Dorado, and also because he had fighting with Spanish military forces which Queen Elizabeth I wanted to avoid. Raleigh was involved in land grab, filibustering schemes. The Schomburgk brothers were also involved in filibustering schemes. Robert Schomburgk made 3 expeditions between 1835 and 1839 before his brother Richard showed up. So Schomburgk was probably the first white man that saw Mount Roraima, and Kukanam. The Schomburgk brothers also dragged Awakaipu into filibustering when they crossed into Venezuela to do their mapping and border grab. The Venezuelan government had granted Robert Schomburgk access to Venezuela because they thought he was doing scientific explorations, which was true. Later on, they were miffed in year 1844 when back in Europe, Robert and Richard produced in London a new border boundary. Venezuela rejected the Schomburgk line. Venezuela realized they weren't going to get any help from Spain on trying to reclaim that disputed border area, and at the time in 1844 they certainly weren't strong enough to take on the world's strongest military, England. In June of 1895, the Guyana-Venezuela boundary dispute spilled onto the international stage during the Grover Cleveland second administration. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was involved, and it was the last time that the United States would have friction with England. Later on, when McKinley came into office, Alfred Thayer Mann, Teddy Roosevelt, and that administration then made allies with England. Anyway, in 1899, an international tribunal awarded the bulk of the disputed territory to Guyana. So the Schomburgk boundary line became about 90% of the new created border that was established in 1899. So this more than 400-year-old border dispute has left Venezuela and its people forever feeling slighted. Another similarity between Jones and Awakaipu was that Jones convinced his more than 70% African American congregation that he was part Native American. Awakaipu, on the other hand, was very impressed with white Europeans and somehow wanted to change his followers into white-skinned people. So after the November 18, 1978 suicide, more than 35 firearms, many of them automatic weapons, were recovered by the Guyanese government authorities and Guyanese defense forces when they first arrived at Jonestown. Countless numbers of firearms had already been looted before they arrived to secure the area. Since Jones and his people had more than 35 firearms on Guyanese soil, that constitutes filibustering. Jim Jones had a private military force on Guyanese soil that later attacked Congressman Ryan and his entourage. In 1979, a band of thieves masquerading as Guyanese police forces checked out of the armory the 35 weapons that were recovered from Jonestown for investigative purposes. They drove away with the weapons and were never seen or heard from again. In Rockville, Maryland, I attended Richard Montgomery High School, the 13 colonies' first filibuster who launched an invasion of Canada, ill-fated. Jones's inner circle member, Laura Reed, also attended and graduated Richard Montgomery High School class of 1965. She went to a high school named after the 13 colonies' first filibuster, and she was involved in Jones's filibustering scheme. I went to see her speak on April 27th, year 2011, in our hometown, Rockville, Maryland. So I was fascinated with Laura Reed's story of attending Woodstock, joining with the Black Panthers in San Francisco, and only months later, in year 1970, joining Jim Jones's People's Temple. So I came away from Laura Johnson Cole's talk in year 2011, realizing that she was probably more of an enabler rather than a deluded victim. Now, one of the most bizarre coincidences with the Jim Jones saga is a Guyanese-born novelist named Edgar Mittelholzer. In 1951, he had published a novel entitled Shadows Move Among Them. He was a writer of many novels with eerie themes. In the novel Shadows Move Among Them, the main protagonist is a difficult Reverend Harmston,
And the story that follows is eerily similar to life at Jonestown. Reverend Harmston establishes a church in the interior jungles of Guyana, named Berkelhoest. Mitzelholder died at age 55 in year 1965 by self-immolation in England. In conclusion, the two mass suicides had in similar skin color dissatisfaction, extreme beliefs, egotistical megalomania, mistresses, cyanide consumption, thousands of followers, isolated locations, filibustering schemes, near border disputed areas. If you'd like to know more about Canaima and the Tepuis, investigate Charles Brewer Correas, the best in the business at what he does.